August 19, 2022. A traveling clergyman, Jehovah's Witnesses, messaged me. #hello. #hi. #love. #love you. #instagood. #instalove. #instadaily. #instamood. #Instagram. #pretty. #beautiful. #smile. #peace. #FYP. August 22, 2022. Fun fact. I have night vision sight. After Richard, I would have to sneak into homes at night. So I adapted to the darkness quickly. #hello. #hi. #love. #I love you. #instagood. #instalove. #instadaily. #instamood. #Instagram. #beautiful. #pretty. #night. August 24, 2022. I broke into a hippie's house and her friends gave me psychedelics, and now we are all best friends. #hello. #hi. #happy. #instagood. #instalove. #instadaily. #instamood. #Instagram. #insta. #for you. #FYP. #love. #smile. #beautiful. August 25, 2022. Wow, I just noticed that 307 of you follow me on this social interaction platform. Thank for sticking with me through my ups and downs, and thank for all the kind words. Maybe when I got 1,000, I will make one of you a gift and have my roommate send it. #hello. #hi. #pretty. #beautiful. #instagood. #insta. #instalove. #instadaily. #photo of the day. #photo. #photographer. #photos. #photography. #love. #happy. #follow train. #follow me. August 31, 2022. Money is the greatest poison to your species. It corrupts all of your minds. Noted. #hello. #hi. #love. #love you. #instagood. #insta. #instalove. #instadaily. #instamood. #Instagram. #photo of the day. #photo. #photos. #happy. #beautiful. #pretty. September 1, 2022. Look. A wonderful art piece at EN4UGH made of me. Thank for the lovely art. You will go far in life, young one. #artwork. #art. #artists on Instagram. #artist. #drawing. #draw. #love. #happy. #high. #cool. #photo of the day. #photo. #photographer. #photos. #photography. September 5, 2022. Through the power of electronic archives, I have found some of my old yearbook photos. I arrived on this planet in 1954, and after Richard used me, I began to learn for myself what humans are. And every decade, 1957, 1969, 1977, 1985, 1996, I'd go to a high school to learn how the education system is. Sadly, it's terrible. Instead of teaching children important life tools, they just make them feel bad for not understanding complex equations that they will never use in real life anyway. I only smiled in the 90s photo because I truly loved that time. People seemed nicer and weren't mean to me for my appearance. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag love. Hashtag Insta good. Hashtag Insta. Hashtag Insta love. Hashtag Insta daily. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag for you. Hashtag photo of the day. Hashtag photo. Hashtag photographer. Hashtag photos. Hashtag yearbook. Hashtag school. September 6, 2022. Here is an old photo of me with a dear friend, Richard Williams. He was an aspiring doctor who came in contact with me in 1954. I only wanted to be his friend, but he used me. He said we were friends, but I was just an experiment to him. I never wanted to show this photo because it brings up emotions that are hard to control, but I'm trying to adapt. Maybe I'll show more photos. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag Insta good. Hashtag Insta. Hashtag Insta love. Hashtag Insta daily. Hashtag Insta mood. Hashtag FYP. Hashtag smile. Hashtag happy. Hashtag teeth. Hashtag ex-friends. September 8, 2022. Polaroids Richard took years ago. He told me I had no reason to be scared, yet he put me in scary situations. I didn't know how to react. The worst was the water. I was in awe at the way the water flowed so peacefully. It was as if it were alive. He pushed me in and set up his camera. I was so scared. I tried to take the form of the water to maybe not get succumbed by it. It was difficult. The cold was the least terrible. The darkness was one I've grown to love, but hated it when Richard was around. I tried to make myself into a light to see. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag Insta good. Hashtag Insta. Hashtag Insta love. Hashtag Insta daily. Hashtag Insta mood. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag love. Hashtag love you. Hashtag pretty. Hashtag beautiful. Hashtag TYP. Hashtag smile. Hashtag hug. September 13, 2022. Richard had obsessions. He had an ex-girlfriend who didn't love him anymore. When I arrived, and he learned that I could shapeshift, he demanded that I try to turn myself into her. I tried to help him, but I only had his description to go off of. No pictures. He was too caught up in her. He always yelled at me because I couldn't look the same. Despite how I was happy the way I looked, he never cared. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag love. Hashtag love you. Hashtag happy. Hashtag excited. Hashtag photo of the day. Hashtag photo. Hashtag photographer. Hashtag photos. Hashtag photography. Hashtag Polaroid. Hashtag Insta good. Hashtag Insta. Hashtag Insta love. Hashtag Insta daily. Hashtag Insta mood. Hashtag FYP. September 21, 2022. Fall is a bittersweet time for me. It was the beginning of everything for me. Now, I will enjoy this wonderful storm and think about everything. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag Insta good. Hashtag Insta. Hashtag Insta love. Hashtag Insta daily. Hashtag Insta mood. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag smile. Hashtag happy. Hashtag excited. Hashtag beautiful. Hashtag pretty. Hashtag love. Hashtag storm. September 25, 2022. Thank for the compliment. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag beautiful. Hashtag pretty. Hashtag Insta good. Hashtag Insta. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag Insta mood. Hashtag Insta daily. Hashtag photography. Hashtag photo of the day. Hashtag photo. Hashtag meme. September 27, 2022. Some of my family have arrived here. Couple things to note. If you see an animal, object, or person that looks slightly off, it may be one of them. So, be nice and respectful. I know it may seem odd, but they are just here to experience the pleasures of being an independent human like you. There is only one that you have to worry about, and I advise you do not go near him if you see him. His name is Vinal Targas, and please, whatever you do not say his name many times out loud, and if you feel him in a dream, ignore him. Thank. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag happy. Hashtag excited. Hashtag pretty. Hashtag beautiful. Hashtag love. Hashtag photo of the day. Hashtag photo. Hashtag photography. Hashtag photographer. Hashtag Insta good. Hashtag Insta. Hashtag Insta daily. Hashtag Insta mood. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag TYP. Hashtag for you. September 28, 2022. Just yesterday, I was notified that I received 400 followers, and this morning, I find out there are 34 more of you. It pleases me to know you all care enough about my life to stay. From the bottom of my heart. Thank. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag smile. Hashtag beautiful. Hashtag pretty. Hashtag photo of the day. Hashtag photo. Hashtag photographer. Hashtag photography. Hashtag photo shoot. Hashtag Insta good. Hashtag Insta. Hashtag Insta daily. Hashtag Insta mood. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag FYP.